We'll turn to John chapter 6 for the sermon. I told you a few weeks ago, by the way, Sister Carly made up a really good handout. I think most of you got one of, if anyone wants one, see Carly after. It's a harmony of the Gospels. That's kind of what we're doing. We're reading in chronological order, but she has all four Gospels on a written document and the events, how they take place in order, and where they are within those four Gospels. It's really handy. There are books written about harmony of the Gospels. Brother Worski wrote a book on the harmony of the Gospels. They all kind of disagree with each other because there are some of the events you really don't know for sure where they took place during his ministry. And so get one of those if you'd like one. But I told you a few weeks ago when we started reading through the Gospels in our daily readings that it's going to be hard for me to not select the Gospel of John most of the time, because I'm just partial to the Gospel of John. It's so good. And this chapter in particular is one of those, what I call holy ground chapters. You know what I mean by that? The whole Bible's inspired. All of it's for our benefit. We're to learn from all of it. But there are certain chapters that when you read it, you just feel like I'm really on holy ground. And in my mind, the Gospel book of John has more of those chapters than probably any other book of the Bible. John chapter 1, that's holy ground. The eternal word. John chapter 3, not just the story of Nicodemus, but it deals with the birth of the Spirit, deals with baptism, and it deals with bride. And it deals with those three in that order, because that's how they're supposed to work out in our life. And so you read John chapter 3, and you're dealing with the new birth, and you're dealing with baptism, and you're dealing with the bride. You're dealing with basically the whole New Testament. So that's a holy ground chapter. And almost all the chapters in John are somewhat that way. I think John chapter 6 is. Certainly John chapter 11, the raising of Lazarus. And then starting in chapter 13 through 17 is in the upper room at the night of his arrest and on the way to the Garden of Gethsemane. And all of those chapters are holy ground, so it's hard for me not to choose John for the sermon of the week. And this John chapter 6 it deals with several different things, but the heart of this chapter is the idea where he says in verse 48, I am the bread of life. So a large part of this chapter is dealing with the idea of bread from heaven. He is that bread from heaven. We are to ingest him, partake of him, and receive the benefit of his life in us. And John chapter 6, let me just read as a text, just one verse 35. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. You think, well, why does he put in the thirst part? So that ties back to John chapter 4, the woman at the well. So you take these two chapters together, John 4 and John 6, entire chapters almost about bread and water. Now, to us, we're thinking about that which sustains you, nourishes you, quenches your thirst. In our day, we think of it more on that level. But to the people he's talking to, who knew the stories of their history so well, heard them all the time, it would immediately come to their minds wilderness journey. In the book of Exodus, chapter 16 and 17, are two chapters that talk about the water from the rock that followed them and daily gave them all the water they needed. And then chapter 17 of Exodus is a story of the manna, that bread from heaven that came down, and all the instructions that in connection to it. And I've always been fascinated with the story of the manna from heaven that was given to them for 40 years, 6 days a week, because on the sixth day, they were to collect double. And the thing about the manna to me is the manna and the water together is it's supposed to express to us, instruct us, that in God's mind, for 40 years, that's all they needed. They didn't need anything else. Now, they demanded meat, so he sent quail to the degree it made them sick and they were vomiting it up. And so he taught them a lesson. You really don't need the quail. I'm just teaching you that. Maybe he allowed them to eat some of their own animals once in a while, but primarily it was bread and water. And I've conjectured, I don't think it's really conjecture, since it was bread from heaven and it's called angels' food in the book of Psalms, which I didn't know angels ate food. That's what it calls it. That in those wafers that they could eat in that form, they could smash it up, make it into a paste or like a multi-meal oatmeal kind of thing. They could cook it, they could bake it. He allowed them to prepare it however they wanted. But the ingredients of it, I've long felt that it provided every bit of nourishment that they needed. It was the perfect superfood. I think it provided them all of the vitamins, all of the minerals, all of the amino acids, all of the whatever elements that we read about that are supposed to help us with our health. I think it was all contained in that manna. And they were limited to the amount. Now, that might mean you think, well, a grown man should have more than a little kid, but they were allowed a certain amount per person in that family. So I think in many cases, the father ate a portion of the child's because the child may not need as much. But God, there's a lot of lessons in the manna. God was teaching them something about you're all equal as citizens of this holy nation. And I'm showing it partly by instructing you, each of you, to take the same amount of manna for yourself. I think because of that, they had no obesity. They had no high blood pressure. They had no heart disease. They had no high cholesterol. They had no kinds of diseases or conditions that are brought about from our diets. So it was designed by God to keep them in perfect health. And then you're walking all the time, so you're in really good shape. There's just so many things about that manna that I think we don't think about or are aware of. But they could have all the water they wanted from that rock. So that, water has no calories, has no, and I'm sure it was as pure water as you could find on earth. So there's no danger from the water. You could have all you wanted, but you were limited with the manna. So this great mixture that the Bible teaches in the New Testament even this great mixture of freedom to have all you want of the water, but limited with the manna to show that life is supposed to be a mixture of freedoms and restrictions. God designed all those principles just within the daily water and the daily manna. It's amazing to me. And the fact that that's all they needed. They could survive on that, and not just survive, but thrive. And be totally healthy just on that diet of manna and water. So now he's bringing stories that they were very familiar with over into the New Testament and applying it to himself. In John 4, I am the water of life. You can have all you want of me, Some might say, well, the Samaritan woman, being a Samaritan, may have not known that story, not being totally Jewish. But Jesus met her at Jacob's well, that Jacob himself had dug. The area of Samaria is where some of the most important events of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's life happened. She would know all those stories, be very familiar with them. And so he is the water of life. And then in chapter 6 is mainly Jewish people, or a mixture at least, and he applies himself to the manna. And he's really trying to get across the idea that he wants us to understand. He is all we need. He has everything within himself that we can partake of, and nothing needs to be added to what he provides. And he takes almost 2 whole chapters to try to get that point across of the water and the bread. The setting for him to talk about himself as the bread of life is the story at the beginning of this chapter, the feeding of the 5,000, the loaves and the fish. So that's still on their minds. And because of providing for so many with so little, in verse 15 of chapter 6, they wanted to take him by force and make him a king. If we can have a king that can feed us every day, it's kind of their thinking. That's what we want. And he rejected their attempt because he didn't want that kind of society. And that whole story, to me, is real interesting. The reading that we had today in Matthew 15 is the feeding of the 4,000. So twice he fed a large group of people with a little bit of bread, a little bit of fish. And I do want you to turn to Matthew 15 to look at one verse that stood out to me this morning as we were reading it. And that story, feeding the 4,000. And Jesus, told his disciples in verse 32, I don't want to send them away hungry. They'd been with him 3 days. So whatever food they had brought with them was gone. And Jesus wanted to feed them. And verse 33 has always intrigued me. It shows the lack, not just of them, but of us. The lack of true spiritual discernment that we often have. Interesting question, isn't it? Verse 33, his disciples said to him, where could we get enough bread in the wilderness to feed such a great multitude? You can just imagine Jesus standing there like, are you really that dull? Are you that dim? I did it every day for 40 years. With about the same amount of people. Can it sink into your skulls at all? I mean, what a question to ask when probably they had talked about and heard about the story of the manna in the wilderness hundreds and hundreds of times by this time of their life. And then they ask a question, it's like, have you ever someone asked you a question and you look at them like, did you just hear what you said? Did you really just say that? And I think Jesus may have had that kind of look. And he went on, of course, to feed them once again. So the setting for the whole discussion of him being the bread of life in John chapter 6 is the event that had just happened, the feeding of the 5,000. So this idea was still fresh in their minds. And so in chapter 6 and verse 22, on the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no boat there except that one which his disciples had entered, that Jesus had not entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone. However, other boats came from Tiberias near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. So this idea of bread comes back up. It was in their memory, and they were hoping it would continue. But just like the woman at the well with the water, he said, give me a drink of water. And then it developed into the discussion, if you drink this water, you'll thirst again. But I have water to give you that if you drink, you'll never thirst again. So he's transitioning from physical water to spiritual. And he's doing the same thing here. Transitioning, because that's the subject on their mind, is the bread they had had yesterday and the fish. And he's transitioning to applying it to himself spiritually. Verse 24, when the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they also got into boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. Why did they seek Jesus? See, you read a verse like that, you think, good, they're seeking Jesus. Everyone needs to seek Jesus. Verse 25, and when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? And Jesus answered them and said, most assuredly I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. So he's revealing their real reason for seeking him. Maybe he's got another meal to feed us with. There's a lot to be said, and we never want to be guilty of preaching a message. And a lot of Christian type churches preach this kind of message to their people so that it develops in their minds the reason for me to seek Jesus is for what he can provide to me. And he does want to provide a lot of great things to us. But that kind of attitude might mean you're putting yourself in the center of your own universe. That his very purpose is to provide for me. And if he doesn't provide for me what I want, in this case, physical food, then I may not follow him anymore because he's not giving me what I really want from him. Whereas we try to preach a message that we deserve nothing from him, and it's only by his grace and love and mercy that he bestows all these wonderful blessings on us. And we're to give him the glory for it and not see him as our servant. We sang servant songs this morning. We are his servants. doing his will, giving him the glory, and he does bless us, and we are to be grateful for it. But our service to Christ is not just on a level of what he can provide for me. And when he doesn't provide for me, I've talked to many people throughout my ministry that basically that's the reason they quit serving Christ. I tried to serve him, I tried to do my best, and then something bad happened in my life, and that's what he's going to do for me, then I'm just going to quit. That is such a self-centered view of the Christian life. And Jesus is trying to get this across to these people. I know that you're only coming to seek me because you're hoping for another free meal. He said in verse 27, do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. See, this is one of those kind of verses. We say the best way to read and study the Bible is to try to take it as literal as possible. But there is a sense that you can over-literalize statements if you isolate the statement from the context. So in other words, you could take the first part of this verse and say, Jesus said, I'm not to labor for food, so I'm just not going to work. I'll let the government take care of me or whatever. Jesus said it, don't labor for food that perishes. Put it in the context, right? That it's comparing the physical labor for physical food with something much more important that should take the priority in our life. Jesus talked a lot about that principle, didn't he? The rich young ruler, I've kept all the commandments. If you notice in that story, it's really interesting if you compare in the different Gospels. They start naming the commandments. And Jesus names the commandments, and the rich young ruler says, I've kept all of them. If you read it carefully, you'll notice that Jesus left off one of the 10 commandments. And the one he left off is the one the man was guilty of. And that's why Jesus said, sell all that you have and give to the poor. And the man went away sorrowful, for he was very rich. He was not willing to do that. So he was guilty of that. That was the commandment that was dominating his life, his wealth, his riches, always wanting more, not willing to share, to use it for the good of others that the Bible talks about. So Jesus exposed that by telling him, go sell all that you have. Again, if you over-literalize certain statements as part of a larger context, you're going to do a lot of wrong things. You could take that and say, well, Jesus said I should go sell all I have and give to the poor. No, he's exposing the besetting sin that was in that particular man and revealing to him, no, you haven't kept all the commandments. Or the other story about the man whose barns were full, and he said to himself, what shall I do? That's one of those great stories. You read it and it's easy to understand, but it reveals so much about human nature. And we dress it up in America because of capitalism, which I believe in. But we dress it up in America in capitalism that we want to be more like him. that you never reach a place in your life where you should be content and use your money to help others, use your money to live a good life, help your church, all those kind of things, and not let dominate your life or control your life. The need to always gain more, to get more wealth, more riches, more property, more things. In American Christianity, that's often promoted as a godly thing. It shows you're industrious. It shows you're, wise in your dealings, business dealings and things. But deep down, it's often something different. Something different. A self-centered life full of greed, wanting to gain more. Because in that particular story, the man said, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger barns. Always wanting more, never enough. And Jesus told that man, your soul is required of you. Because you're choosing under the guise of good things, making yourself look good, always wanting more. And so that's the priority in your life. And, in our little church, the Lord has blessed our people financially, materially, nice homes, nice cars, nice possessions, retirement accounts, savings, investments. I'd like to think that none of us are so driven in that direction that that's the priority of our life. That's the most dominant thing in our thinking and planning, rather than that which came down from heaven to provide our spirit, our soul, riches that are beyond the things of this life. So he says down in, we'll skip down to verse 32. Verse 31, our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. There are people who say that Jesus never claimed divinity. And I read verses like this and I think, how do they reach that conclusion? How can he as a person say, I am the bread that the Father gives from heaven to people, and he not be divine, not be the Son of God? Just this very comparison means that he's more than a human. He's bread that gives people life, spiritual life. But again, like the woman at the well, when he said, the water I have to give, you'll never thirst again, she said, please give me this water. But she was still thinking of physical water. I never have to come to Jacob's well again. I can have all the water I want and stay at home. And they're thinking this also. So then they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. Because that's what God did for them in the wilderness for 40 years daily. And they're still thinking along that line. Jesus said to them in verse 35, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger. He who believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe. And he goes on to bring out this idea that he was sent to give them life. Skipping down to verse 47, most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me has everlasting life. That daily bread. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. So even though it sustained them during those 40 years, they eventually did die because of age or whatever, but it wasn't able to give them continual life. But what he's offering is able to give them eternal life. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. The Jews therefore quarreled among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? They're still thinking about, in human terms, or not heavenly or spiritual terms. And you can understand why they might be confused, but he's exposing their inability to apply it spiritually. And Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood. So now he's talking about flesh and blood besides water and bread. So I can understand why it would start to confuse them. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. So he adds a resurrection idea. So he's trying to take it further than their ability to grasp it. And part of the reason he does this, again, is to expose what's in their heart, that they're not capable of receiving it in a way that will benefit them spiritually because of their condition. For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me will live because of me. So he places the idea of eternal life, which was a common idea among the Jews, and they viewed eternal life as the life in the kingdom age with the Messiah as their king and them receiving all the blessings. And he's putting this in himself. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. He who eats this bread will live forever. These things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. So you can kind of understand why they're struggling with this a little bit. We all struggle with these same ideas because we're still in the flesh and we still think of things in a human way rather than maybe on a higher level. So therefore, many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, this is a hard. The word hard means difficult. Saying, who can understand it? So let's think of it this way. His miracles were easy to understand, weren't they? There's a blind man. He touches the guy's eyes. He can see. They knew that this guy was blind all of his life. What is there not to understand? So it's not his miracles that were hard to understand. It was his words. His words were hard to understand. I told someone the other day when I first started preaching, I was advised by several different older preachers that you might think it good to bring a lot of sermons from the gospel books, but be careful about that because the words of Jesus are not as simple as you think, and you might say wrong things in your early sermons until you get a better handle on what he's really trying to say in the Gospels. And I've learned that to be true through the years. We love the gospel books and the stories and the miracles and the words of Jesus. We love those red letters. You start thinking about what he said in this chapter, and it's not the easiest to understand. Eat his flesh and drink his blood. We know it means to partake of him. We know it means to share his life with us. But again, he's putting it in terminology that is a little difficult. When Jesus knew in himself that his disciples, So it wasn't just unbelievers who said this, it was also his disciples complained about this. He said, "Does this offend you? What then if you should see the Son of Man ascend where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing." So he's letting them know you're thinking just on a fleshly human level. "The words that I speak to you are spirit and they are life." So if your spirit is not in a good condition, you can't really handle the words of the Spirit. But there are some of you who do not believe, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe and who would betray him. And he said, "Therefore I have said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted to him by my Father." From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. One of the saddest verses in the Bible, isn't it? But we don't see Jesus begging them to come back. We don't see him even weeping over it. I'm sure it made him sad. But he knew that they were there for more bread and fish. He knew they were there to see more miracles. He knew they were there for reasons other than that which would benefit their eternity, their spiritual life. And he wanted to expose it because, as I've said lately, he was in the process, as painful as it was, he was in the process of separating the chaff from the wheat. He had to do that so that by the end of his ministry, he had gathered the wheat into his barn so that the chaff could face the fire of judgment. It was not a pleasant process, but it had to be done. And Jesus said to the 12, "Do you also want to go away?" That's a tough question to hear. We're kind of hard on Simon Peter sometimes at things he said without thinking and made him look bad, but there were times he said exactly the right thing. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Also, we have come to believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Then he goes on to talk about Judas Iscariot. So Jesus has the words of eternal life. He is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Where else shall we go? Do you know him? Do you have eternal life? Have you placed your trust in him, given your life to him, daily feasting on that water and bread that is him? But there must be that first experience, that first drink of water, that first taste of bread that gives you his life, and then continue enjoying that experience throughout your life. He is the bread from heaven. Whoever believes in me shall never hunger. I invite you to come to Christ today as we prepare and sing a verse of invitation. John chapter 6 requires something more from us. It requires meditation and prayer and thought. It requires us to think more deeply about what he came to do and what he offers us. He offers us everything. It's all in him. So if you don't know him, I pray you will today. Let's all stand.